The deed they handed Birdie Norris was so wrinkled and water-stained that the county clerk had laughed out loud when he stamped it, and she had stared him dead in the eye until the laughter died in his throat like a fire swallowed by sand. It was the autumn of 1878, in the territory of Kansas, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of civilization like a man leaning too far over a cliff, loud, reckless, and convinced it would never fall. The land rush had come through and carved the territory into parcels like a butcher working a carcass, and when Birdie Norris had presented herself at the land office with every dollar she had saved over 4 years of cooking, sewing, and keeping house for other people's families, the men behind the counter had looked at her the way men in those days always looked at a woman who walked in alone and asked for something. They had given her the plot nobody wanted. The one at the far northwestern edge of the territory, where the creek ran brown half the year, where the soil was so rocky it had broken 3 plows before anyone gave up on it entirely, and where the only thing that seemed to grow without any encouragement whatsoever was a particular kind of thistle that cut through leather boots and left welts on a person's ankles for days. Everyone in Caldwell knew that plot. It had a name, though nobody had given it one officially. People called it the Sorrow Acres, and they said it with something between pity and satisfaction, the way people speak about anything they believe to be a lost cause. Birdie Norris was 26 years old, 5 feet and 3 inches tall, and had arms that were stronger than they looked because she had been doing the work of 2 people since she was 9 years old. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, brown eyes that were extremely direct, and a jaw that her mother had once told her was too stubborn to be pretty. She had taken that as a compliment even then. She loaded everything she owned into the back of a rented wagon on an October morning when the sky was the kind of gray that means business, and she drove out to the Sorrow Acres alone. It was worse than she had been told. The creek that ran along the eastern edge was not just brown, it was sullen, the way water gets when it has been poorly treated. The soil, where she knelt and dug her fingers into it, was hard and reluctant, laced through with limestone shelves that jutted up like broken teeth. There was no standing structure. The previous man who had tried to work this land had left behind a half-collapsed fence line and one post that still stood, more out of habit than structural integrity. The thistle was everywhere, waist-high in places, rattling in the wind like it owned the place, which, until about 3 days ago, it had. Birdie stood in the middle of the property in the cold October wind and looked at it for a long time. She did not cry. She had used up her tears for this particular variety of unfairness years ago and found them to be largely inefficient. Instead, she pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her coat and began to write down what she saw. She was still writing when she heard a horse. The man who rode up was perhaps 29 or 30, with the kind of lean, weathered build that comes from years of outdoor work rather than years of avoiding it. He wore a battered hat with a dark sweat-stained band, a canvas coat that had been mended at both elbows, and boots that had clearly seen more hard country than any boots deserved. He had a jaw with about 3 days of dark growth on it, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. He was leading a second horse, a solid-looking bay, on a rope behind him. He pulled up about 10 feet from her and looked at the land and then at her, and then at the notebook in her hand, and then back at the land. "You the one who bought this," he said. His voice was low and had the careful quality of someone who does not speak often but means what he says when he does. "I am," Birdie said. He was quiet for a moment. A wind came through and the thistle rattled. "I'm Lewis Walden," he said. "I run the neighboring spread to the south. I saw your wagon." He paused. "You know what they call this land?" "I know what they call it," Birdie said. "I also know what limestone over clay means for water retention, and I know where the south-facing slope is, and I know that thistle only grows this thick where there is enough nitrogen in the ground to support it, which means this soil is not as dead as it looks." Lewis Walden looked at her for a longer moment than was strictly comfortable. "You're not a farmer," he said, not unkindly. You don't have the look of someone who was raised on a working farm. No, Birdie said. I was raised in St. Louis. I read every book on agriculture I could find in a library over the course of 2 years before I came out here. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite amusement and not quite respect. It was something in between, the look a person gets when they have made an assumption and reality has arrived to correct it. What's your name? Birdie Norris. He nodded slowly, looking back at the land. The creek's not as bad as it looks in October. Runs cleaner in spring when the snowmelt comes off the hills. The real trouble is this limestone shelf. You try to plant root vegetables, you will break your back before they break through. What would you plant? She asked, and it was a genuine question. She held her notebook ready. He seemed surprised to be asked. He looked at the land again with a different expression now, the careful, focused look of a man who actually knew something about soil. Winter wheat on the south-facing slope, that limestone won't bother the grain roots much. They go sideways more than down. On the northern section where the creek drainage is softer, you might try sorghum come spring. And the eastern flat, close to the creek, that is where I would put a kitchen garden with raised beds. You build the beds up on top of the limestone, you do not fight it, you work over it. Birdie was writing quickly. And the thistle, cut it, burn it, use the ash on the soil. Thistle-ash is decent for breaking down clay hardpan. She looked up from her notebook. He was watching her write with an expression she could not entirely read. You have been thinking about this land, she said. Before today. He looked a little caught. I have walked this boundary line a time or two, he said. Wondering what somebody might do with it if they knew what they were doing. He paused, and something in his tone shifted. Which I'll admit I was not sure about a few minutes ago. I apologize for that. Appreciate the honesty, Birdie said. Both times. He almost smiled. It changed his face considerably. He gathered his reins and the bay horse moved a little. I'll let you get on with it then, Miss Norris. If you have questions about the creek or the soil in the lower section, I am easy to find, just south. Thank you, Mr. Walden. He turned his horse and rode south, and Birdie watched him go for just a moment before she looked back down at her notebook and added 3 more lines of observations. She set up her camp that first night in the bed of the rented wagon with a wool blanket and a cast iron pan and a bag of cornmeal, and she listened to the wind moving through the thistle and thought about winter wheat and limestone, and the way a man's eyes change color when he is actually paying attention to something. She built her house before winter properly arrived. It took her 3 weeks, and it was not a large house. 1 main room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace. She mortared herself from the limestone she pulled out of the ground while clearing the south-facing slope. She had hired 2 men from Caldwell, Ennis Boyle and his teenage nephew, to help her with the roof beams, but everything else she did herself. Ennis Boyle was not a cruel man, but he was skeptical, and he said more than once that she was setting herself up for a rough winter on rough land. She paid him exactly what they had agreed on and no more and no less, and when he drove back toward Caldwell, he was quiet for most of the journey, thinking about the way she had handled a level with the focused precision of someone who had practiced. The house was solid, small but solid. The fireplace drew well. She plastered the inside walls with a clay and straw mixture that held the heat, and she lined the 1 window with oilcloth against the coming cold. She set up her kitchen, which was her favorite part. The cast iron stove she had saved 3 months extra for. The shelves she built from the fence lumber the previous failed farmer had left behind. The small table and the single good chair. In November, she walked the south-facing slope and turned the soil where the limestone gave way to a deeper seam of loam, and she planted winter wheat. Her back ached every evening. Her hands bled from the thistle cutting for the first 2 weeks until she made proper gloves from a piece of heavy canvas. She burned the thistle in piles and spread the ash and turned it in, and every morning she went out and looked at the land and thought about spring. She saw Lewis Walden again in the 2nd week of November, when she was driving a wagon load of fence posts she had bought in Caldwell. He was riding along his southern fence line when she passed, and he pulled up, and they stood at the boundary between their properties for a while and talked about the weather and what she was planning for the garden beds in spring. He had a practical manner of conversation that she found deeply restful after a lifetime of dealing with people who spoke around what they meant. He said things directly and without performance, and she found herself talking to him longer than she intended. He helped her unload the fence posts without being asked, walking over to her side of the line and picking up posts as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. She did not thank him effusively because she could tell he would have found that uncomfortable. She just said, "That saved me about 40 minutes," and he said, "You're welcome," and they worked in a companionable quiet that surprised both of them equally. Over the following weeks, these meetings became something she had not planned for. He would appear at the boundary line, sometimes with a practical purpose, to tell her the creek was running high and she should check her eastern drainage, or to bring back a tool she had left near the fence, and sometimes without one. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn about landscape while walking through it. He had come from Tennessee as a boy with his father and an older brother named Calhoun, who had died of fever 8 years ago. He had run the spread alone since then. He had a good horse sense and a thorough knowledge of the Kansas territory, whether that came from watching it carefully for many years. He read, which surprised some people and did not surprise Birdie at all, because she had noticed from the beginning that he was a man who paid attention to things. He had a small collection of books that he was not sentimental about. He would give one away if he thought it would be useful to someone. And he had lent her a book on soil management that he had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis, and she had given it back with notes in the margins that he had read very carefully after she returned it. He was 30 years old. He had never married. She had asked him with her characteristic directness, why not, one afternoon in late November when they were sitting on opposite sides of the fence line eating lunch, because neither of them had eaten and they both happened to be at the boundary at the same time, which had begun to happen more than coincidence could comfortably account for. He was quiet for a while before he answered. "I had a consideration with a woman here in the territory 3 years ago," he said. "She went back east. I do not think she knew what she was getting into when she imagined frontier life, and I do not think I explained it well enough." He looked at the landscape, not at Birdie. "I would rather be alone than be with someone who is miserable where I am." Birdie looked at him steadily. "That is a wise and lonely thing to say." He looked at her then, startled a little by the precision of it. And then he did that thing she was beginning to recognize, the slight softening around his eyes that meant something had landed. She told him about herself in return, because fairness required it. She had grown up in St. Louis with a mother who cleaned other people's houses and a father who had been there and then not been there, the way some fathers are. She had kept herself by cooking and sewing and caring for children. She had saved money for 4 years with a specific destination in mind, not Caldwell particularly, but the idea of land, of something that was hers, something that could not be taken back. She had chosen Caldwell because she had read about the land opportunities in the territory, and because nobody there knew her and she could begin clean. "You planned this for 4 years, Lewis said. 5, if you count the year I first thought about it seriously," Birdie said. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief but in something closer to admiration. "Most people are not that patient." "Most people," Birdie said, "have more options." He understood that without further explanation, and she was grateful for it. December came in hard. The temperature dropped fast after Christmas and the creek froze along its edges, and Birdie's world contracted to the house. The livestock she had acquired: 2 milk cows, a flock of chickens, and a mule named Gerald who had opinions, and the necessary daily work of surviving winter on an unestablished farm. She had laid in good stores. She had been careful. But the cold was something she had not entirely prepared herself for emotionally, the bone-deep isolation of it, the way the snow silenced everything outside her walls, the way the days were so short that she sometimes worked by lamplight at both ends. Lewis Walden rode over in the first week of January during a break in the weather. He came to the door and knocked, which struck her as endearing because it was her house, and no one had knocked on a door for her in a very long time. He had a rabbit he had snared, and a sack of potatoes from his root cellar, and a slightly uncertain expression, as if he was not entirely sure of his welcome. "I thought you might want company," he said. "Or I could leave the rabbit and go." "Come in," Birdie said. "I have been talking to Gerald the mule for 3 days, and it is beginning to affect my sense of reality." He laughed. It was a real, surprised laugh, the kind that happens before a person can decide whether to let it, and it changed his whole face, and Birdie felt something shift in her chest the way the earth shifts slightly during a deep thaw, subtle but total. He stayed for supper. They cooked the rabbit together in her cast iron pot with the potatoes and some dried herbs she had brought from Caldwell, and they sat at her small table in the firelight and talked for 4 hours. They talked about books they had read and things they had observed about people, and about farming, and about the particular quality of Kansas winter light, and about whether Caldwell would survive another decade of the cattle drives, or whether the railroad expansion would change everything. They disagreed on the railroad. He was skeptical and she was optimistic, and neither of them convinced the other, which they both found satisfying rather than frustrating. When he stood to leave, the fire had burned down to coals and the night outside was clear and bright with stars, the cold so sharp the air seemed to ring with it. He put on his coat and hat at the door and stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and Birdie stood a few feet away, and there was something in the space between them that was not quite tension and not quite ease, but something that contained both. "I am glad you came," she said. "I am glad you did not send me away with the rabbit," he said. She smiled. He saw it, and something in him seemed to settle, like a thing that had been restless finding a place to be still. He rode home under the stars, and she stood in the doorway for longer than the cold justified, watching the lamp of his lantern move south across the dark land until it disappeared. January went on. He came back the following week, and the week after that. These were not casual visits. The cold and the distance made casual visits impossible. Each one was a deliberate choice, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it directly for a while because there were things between them that were too careful and too new to be named too quickly. The town of Caldwell had opinions about all of this, naturally. Birdie had gone into the general store in the second week of November to buy supplies, and had dealt with the particular atmosphere that small frontier towns generate around a woman alone, not hostile exactly, but watchful and doubtful, and full of small sideways comments. A woman named Dorothy Pratt, who was the wife of the man who ran the hardware store and who considered herself an authority on local social order, had said within Birdie's earshot that it was a shame, a woman out there alone on that worthless piece of land, and someone ought to tell her to go back where she came from before she froze to death trying to prove something. Birdie had bought her supplies, paid the full amount, and said to Dorothy Pratt on the way out, very pleasantly, "I have no intention of going anywhere. I hope you'll come see what I've done with the place come spring." And she had walked out with her head level and her back straight, and several people in the store had found reasons to look at something else. But Caldwell was not entirely unkind. There was a man named Rupert Shade who ran the feed store and who was practical, and did not waste time on other people's business. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, and had a wife named Vera who brought Birdie a crockery pot of preserved peaches in December, in case the winter gets longer than expected, without preamble or explanation. Birdie had nearly wept over those peaches, not for weakness but for the unexpected warmth of them. There was also the woman named Constance Foley, who ran the small dressmaking operation out of her house 2 streets from the main road, and who had found out somehow that Birdie could sew and had asked, with businesslike brevity, whether she would be interested in doing piecework through the winter for money. Birdie had said yes. She had sewn by lamplight in the evenings for 3 months, and the extra money had bought the seed she would need for spring. Lewis knew about the sewing because she had told him, and he had said nothing unnecessary about it. What he had said was, "You are building everything at once. The land and the money and the supplies. Most people try one thing at a time." She had said, "I do not have the luxury of sequence." And he had been quiet in the particular way he was quiet when something mattered to him, when he was absorbing rather than deflecting. February was when things shifted between them, though neither of them would have been able to say exactly when during February it happened. It was a month of small moments that accumulated like snowfall, each one light and unremarkable alone, together becoming weight. He brought her a book he thought she would like, A Natural History of the Kansas Prairie by a man from the State Agricultural College, and stayed to talk about it. She fed a calf through a difficult birth one afternoon when he was there helping her manage the cow, and he watched her work with a focus and steadiness that had earned the animal's trust, and something about that had moved him in a way he was still thinking about 3 days later. She looked up once, midway through, her hair loose from its pin and her coat covered in the evidence of farm work, and their eyes met and held for a moment too long and too honest to be anything other than what it was. He had ridden home that evening thinking about her eyes. Brown and direct and containing, he thought, some sort of weather system all their own, clear in good moments and deeply complicated in others, but always looking straight at what was in front of them. She had gone to bed that night thinking about his hands, which were the hands of someone who had worked the land for a long time and who had also done careful fine work. She had seen him repair a piece of tack harness with a precision that most people reserved for things they thought of as delicate, and there was something in the combination of the roughness and the care that she could not stop turning over. It was on the last day of February, a cold, clear evening with a sky like pale iron, that he said something true about it for the first time. He had come over to help her reinforce the chicken house against predators. Something had been at it, probably a fox, and they had worked through the late afternoon into early evening, and she had made coffee, and they were sitting on the front step of her house in their coats with the coffee cups warming their hands, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that is so comfortable it becomes its own form of intimacy. "Birdie," he said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the dark flat of the property, at the beginnings of the winter wheat stubble showing through the last of the snow. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "All right," she said. "I look for reasons to come over here," he said. "The rabbit was real, the fence was real, the chicken house is real, but I would have come anyway. I want you to know that, because I think you deserve to know what is actually happening." Birdie held her coffee cup with both hands and felt the warmth of it and felt something else, something larger than warmth, moving through her chest like the sound of the creek in spring when the water is running fast and clean. "I know what is happening," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her then fully, and there was such a directness in it that it matched her own. They were, she had come to understand, remarkably similar in their preference for honesty over performance, and it made everything between them feel like solid ground. "I'm not sure what to do about it," he said, "given that you are working everything you have into this land, and I do not want to be another complication." "Lewis," she said, "you have been the least complicated thing about this winter." He was quiet for a moment. The stars were appearing above them, one at a time, bright and ancient. "I am not a man who says things I do not mean," he said. "I know that," she said. "It is one of the things I value about you most. Then I will tell you that I have not thought about another person this consistently since I cannot remember when," he said, "and that when I am here, things feel." He paused, looking for the word with the careful attention he gave to all important things. "Correct. Things feel correct." Birdie set her coffee cup down on the step and looked at him and said what was true. "I feel that too." He reached over and his hand covered hers on the step between them, large and warm and certain, and she turned her hand over and held on. And that was the thing itself, not a declaration or a ceremony but a simple fact, acknowledged, held between them in the cold air under the February stars. They sat like that for a long time without needing to say anything more. March arrived like a fighter shaking loose from a long hold, aggressive and changeable, warm one day and brutal the next. But the light was returning, and the ground was beginning to yield under Birdie's boots where the frost was retreating. She was out in it every day now, working from the first gray light until she could not see. She was preparing the south-facing slope for the sorghum and extending the winter wheat that was showing green, and she had begun the raised beds along the eastern flat, hauling limestone blocks to build the walls and filling them with a composted soil mixture she had been building all winter. Lewis helped when he could, which was most days now, either mornings or evenings depending on what his own operation demanded. They fell into a rhythm that was entirely natural, working alongside each other with an efficiency that came from paying attention to how the other person moved and thought. He knew when to offer help and when to let her work alone because he was observant enough to read the difference between difficulty she wanted to solve herself and difficulty she genuinely wanted a second pair of hands for. She brought him coffee without asking because she knew when he had been working since dawn and needed it, and she brought it strong, which she had established he preferred. There was a morning in mid-March, the kind of morning when the sky was clear and bright blue, and the air smelled like earth opening up, when they were working on the raised beds together, and she was lifting a limestone block that was too heavy, and he stepped in without thinking and took the weight with her, and their hands overlapped on the rough stone, and they were very close, closer than work required, and they both noticed it simultaneously, and neither of them moved away. "Birdie," he said, in that voice he had when something was happening that mattered. She looked up at him from a distance of about 6 inches. This close she could see that his eyes were more green than gray in the morning light, and that there was a small scar just below his left cheekbone she had never been close enough to notice before. "Yes," she said, because she already knew what was coming and was not inclined to make him work for it unnecessarily. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would consider." "Lewis Walden," she said, "you have been courting me since October. We both know that." He looked startled for half a second, and then something settled in his face like a landscape finding its final shape. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said. "It was always a yes." He set down the limestone block, and she set down her side, and he put both his hands on her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the calloused roughness of them, and he kissed her for the first time standing in the mud of her eastern flat with the limestone walls of the raised beds around them, and the morning sky enormous above them, and the smell of the waking earth everywhere. And it was as honest and direct and simple and total as everything else about him. And she kissed him back with the same quality, and it was exactly right. She did not let it distract her from the work. This was an important thing she had decided, not because the love was less important, but because the love was real, and real things can stand alongside other real things without one destroying the other. Lewis understood this completely. He did not expect her to stop working. He did not expect her to need less from the land because she had him now. He was, in the most fundamental way, proud of what she was building, and that pride was something she had not known how much she needed until she felt it. In the 3rd week of March, Dorothy Pratt came out to the Sorrow Acres. Birdie saw the wagon coming from a distance and did not stop what she was doing, which was transplanting seedlings in the eastern flat. When Dorothy Pratt climbed down from the wagon and stood at the edge of the property looking around her, Birdie straightened, pulled off her gloves, and walked over. Dorothy Pratt had the expression of a woman who has been proved wrong and has not yet decided what to do about it. The winter wheat on the south-facing slope was vivid green and thick. The raised beds along the eastern flat were complete and already showing the first growth of kitchen garden plants. The house was small but clearly well-maintained, with a kitchen garden starting around the south wall, and there was a fence line that was straight and solid, and the whole place had the unmistakable feeling of a thing in the process of becoming. "You have been busy," Dorothy Pratt said, somewhat flatly. "I have," Birdie said. "I came to—" Dorothy stopped. She looked at the winter wheat again. I came because my husband mentioned the raised beds. He said the limestone wall construction was sound. He was interested in it. He has trouble with his north field, similar soil. Birdie waited. Dorothy Pratt straightened her shoulders and produced, with some difficulty, a small jar of something. I brought you blackberry preserves, she said. From last summer I had more than I needed. Birdie took the preserves. Thank you, Mrs. Pratt. Would you like to see the beds? I can show you the limestone construction and how the soil preparation works, in case it would help your husband with his north field. Dorothy Pratt's expression underwent a complicated series of changes. I would, she said, with somewhat less difficulty than before. Yes, I think I would. They walked the property for an hour. Birdie explained the thistle-burn method and the raised bed construction and the south-facing slope planting strategy without condescension and without any reference to the things Dorothy had said in the general store in November. She was not performing generosity. She was simply more interested in the practical matter at hand than in the record of past small cruelties. Dorothy Pratt left with pages of notes she had made herself on a small pad she had brought from her coat pocket, which told Birdie that she had come with more intention than the blackberry preserves implied. Lewis was there when Dorothy's wagon was leaving, having ridden over in the late afternoon. He watched the wagon go with mild surprise. Was that Dorothy Pratt? He said. She had questions about the raised beds, Birdie said. Lewis looked at Birdie with that expression she was now well acquainted with, the one that meant he was experiencing something like admiration mixed with something like wonder. You know, she told half the town in November that this land was going to break you, he said. I know, Birdie said. I also know she has a husband with a difficult north field, and I know what to do about that. Both things are true. She picked up her gloves. Come see the seedlings. I want your opinion on the spacing on the third row. He followed her toward the eastern flat with that soft, particular look on his face, and if she noticed it, she did not comment, because she had learned that pointing out his softer moments made him go quiet, and she preferred him talking. April brought the creek running clear, exactly as he had said it would, snowmelt from the low hills to the northwest cleaning out the brown sediment, and running the water sweet and cold along the eastern boundary of her property. She stood at the bank one April morning and dipped her hand in the current and felt it, cold and real and running, and she thought about the deed in her strongbox with the county clerk's laugh still somehow attached to it, and she felt something she did not have a word for, but that was in the family of triumph and gratitude and grief, because some victories carry inside them the memory of all the effort that made them necessary. The winter wheat on the south-facing slope was as fine a stand of grain as anyone in the county could remember for a first-year crop. Rupert Shade came out in April to see it because word had gotten around the feed store, and he stood at the edge of the slope and looked at it with the practiced eye of a man who had been buying and selling grain for 20 years. This is first-year soil, he said. It is, Birdie said. He shook his head slowly. That is not nothing, Miss Norris. That is actually something. He offered her a forward purchase contract on the wheat at harvest at a price she considered fair. She said she would think about it, and she did think about it for 2 days. And then she signed it, because his price was honest and she knew it. And she added a clause about the following year's sorghum because she was already planning that far ahead, and it was good to have someone willing to plan with her. Lewis was with her when she signed the contract, and afterward Rupert Shade shook his hand, and then looked between the two of them in the particular way that Caldwell had been looking between them for weeks now, with a knowing satisfaction that the town had mostly managed not to say directly out loud, though Constance Foley had said it directly out loud to Birdie a month ago. That man has been waiting for someone like you, Constance had said, trimming thread at her sewing table. He just did not know what someone like you looked like until you showed up. The town was warming to Birdie in the way that places warm to people who turn out to be right about something. Not wholesale and not without reservation. Dorothy Pratt's conversion was real but not universal, And there were still men who looked at her land and her operation with the sideways look of people who are made uncomfortable by a woman's competence. But there were more Rupert shades than Dorothy Pratts she was finding in the actual grain of the place, and the ones who mattered most were the ones who dealt in what was real. There was a morning in late April, a Sunday, when neither of them had to be anywhere in particular, and Lewis took her riding across his property, a proper ride, with both of them on horses and no destination, following the landscape where it went. His land was different from hers, flatter and more established, with fields that were already productive and a well-built barn, and a house that was square and solid, and had been added to over the years in a way that showed the accretion of someone's life there. She had seen it before, but never in the spring light, and the spring light made everything true. They stopped at the highest point of his property, a low rise that let you see both spreads at once, and the site was something her property to the northwest with the bright green wheat slope and the line of the raised beds visible along the creek, and his to the south with the established fields and the barn, and the two together made a picture that had its own kind of logic, its own natural wholeness. Lewis looked at it for a long time without speaking, which she knew by now was not reticence but depth. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the logical and natural next question," he said. He looked at her, "and I am trying to figure out whether it is too soon to ask it." Her heart did the thing it did now when he looked at her with that particular quality of attention. "I am 26, Lewis, not 17. I do not require a lengthy courtship to know my own mind." He turned on his horse to face her fully. The spring light was in his eyes, making them very green. "Birdie Norris," he said, "will you marry me?" It was a sentence, not a question, not because he was presuming, but because he was not a man who turned real things into performances with rising inflections and theatrical uncertainty. He said it straight and clear, the way he said everything that mattered. "Yes," she said, the same way she had said it to him on the step in February, the same way she said everything she meant. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand and held it, and they sat on that low rise and looked at the two spreads of land below them that were going to be one, and the sky above them was the wide high blue of Kansas in late April, and the wind came through the grass and the wheat and the creek ran somewhere below them, and everything was exactly what it was. They married in June. It was not a large wedding. The preacher from Caldwell came out, and the ceremony was held in the yard of Birdie's house. She had insisted on that, and Lewis had not argued, understanding exactly why. And the guests were Rupert Shade and his wife Vera, Constance Foley, Ennis Boyle, who had helped with the roof beams and who shook Lewis's hand with a look that communicated something about how he had been wrong and was not unhappy about it, and a few others from the county who had become real to Birdie over the months. Even Dorothy Pratt came and brought a second jar of blackberry preserves, this time accompanied by a pot of honey, and did not say anything awful to anyone. Birdie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from St. Louis, a deep green cotton with small white flowers in the print, and she wore her hair loose for the first time in public since she had arrived in the territory, and Lewis stood at the front of the small gathering in his best coat and his cleanest hat, and looked at her coming across the yard toward him with an expression that he made no effort whatsoever to moderate. And everyone who saw it would remember it later as one of the most honest things they had ever witnessed. The preacher read the words. They said what was required to be said. Lewis slid onto her finger a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had chosen with the particular care he gave to everything, and it fit perfectly because he had borrowed one of her other rings to get the size, and she had not noticed until after, and when she found out, she had laughed with a surprise and delight that had lit her whole face. The supper afterward was long and warm, held on the south-facing slope of her wheat field, because the evening light was beautiful there. They ate and talked, and Rupert Shade made a toast that was practical and sincere in equal measure, and Vera Shade cried a little, and Constance Foley did not cry but came very close, and Lewis kept his hand on the table next to Birdie's, not always touching but always within reach. And when the light finally went and the stars came out, they were the same stars as that February evening on the step, but they meant more now because everything had names now, and named things are more real. Summer was abundant. The winter wheat harvest came in at a yield that made Rupert Shade say, "Well, I'll be," quietly to himself when he saw the wagon loads coming in. The sorghum in the northern section was growing with a determination that matched the soil's general stubbornness, and Birdie had discovered that if she tended the sorghum the way the limestone allowed, not fighting the ground but working with what it would give, the result was something the ground seemed proud of. She and Lewis merged their operations gradually, in the practical sense sharing equipment, coordinating labor, treating the two spreads as one larger connected operation while maintaining the legal separateness of the deeds, which Birdie had insisted on not for any emotional reason, but because she understood property law and knew that a woman's separate deed in her own name was not a thing to surrender without reason. Lewis had agreed without argument, which had made her love him with an extra dimension she had not been expecting. He moved his things to her house, or rather they furnished it together, gradually adding to it as the farm produced money, making the small space into something that was genuinely theirs. They built an addition in the fall, a second room for storage and for the work of winter sewing and record-keeping, and the addition changed the shape of the house from small to adequate, and adequate to them meant generous. By September, the property had a name. It had developed the name organically, which is the way the best names come. Someone said something in passing, and it stuck. It was Rupert Shade who did it, looking at the harvest records Birdie had showed him in his store, the yields from a piece of land that had been considered worth nothing, and he had said, with the thoughtful gravity of someone recognizing something real, "You know what you are building out there. You are building a proper concern, a real working concern." And somehow from there the place became known in Caldwell as the Lewis Walden concern, and then just the Walden concern, though Birdie's name remained first in the land records, and she saw to it that it stayed there. She had not expected the thing that happened in October, a full year after she had arrived. She had been feeling oddly tired for a few weeks, and she had attributed it to the harvest work, which was exhausting. But it was Vera Shade who looked at her over the counter in the feed store one day in early October with the particular knowing look of a woman who has had 4 children, and said gently, "How are you feeling, Birdie, truly?" And Birdie had stopped and considered, and something had arranged itself in her mind with the clarity she was good at, and she had driven home in something close to shock. Lewis was in the barn when she arrived. She went and stood in the barn doorway and waited until he looked up from what he was doing, which was replacing a broken hame on a collar, and when he looked up she said, "I think we are going to have a child." He set down the hame. He was very still for a moment, and she could not read him, and for the first time in months she could not read him, and she felt a small, cold spike of uncertainty. Then his face, his honest, weathered, careful, green-eyed face, did something she had never seen it do before. Every single thing in it opened at once, all the quiet and all the reserve and all the careful economy with which he expressed himself, and what was underneath it was enormous and bright, and without reservation. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her with a care that was also strength, and she felt him press his forehead against the side of her head, and he said, "Are you all right?" His first thought being her, and she said, I am very well." And they stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, and the October light coming through the gaps in the boards in long yellow bars, and she cried, which surprised her, because she had thought she was past the point of being surprised by her own emotions. But this particular thing, this evidence of the future, of continuation, of something she had never let herself plan for because she had been too busy with necessity, this undid her in a way that the hard work never had. He held her while she cried and said quiet things, And then she stopped and they looked at each other and she laughed, which surprised her even more, and he laughed too. And it was one of those moments that is so large and complete it seems to contain all the other moments that led to it. The baby was born in July of 1879, a boy, and they named him Calhoun for Lewis's brother, which was Lewis's suggestion, and which Birdie had agreed to immediately, understanding what it meant to him. Calhoun Walden was a boy of very firm opinions from the beginning, which everyone who had met his mother found entirely predictable, and he had his father's eyes, that gray-green that changed depending on the light, which Birdie found herself looking at with a frequency and a tenderness that she had not entirely prepared herself for. Rupert Shade came to see the baby and brought a bottle of something that was, he said, for Lewis and not the occasion specifically, which was his way of celebrating. Vera Shade brought more practical things: cloth for small garments, a crockery pot of bone broth, wisdom about sleeping schedules delivered with the gentle authority of experience. Constance Foley arrived 2 days later with a small handmade blanket of such exquisite construction that Birdie looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then looked at Constance and said, "You have been saving this wool." And Constance said, "I have been saving this wool, yes." And that was all that needed to be said about it. Dorothy Pratt came. She stood at the door with a covered dish and looked at the baby in Birdie's arms with an expression that was soft in a way Dorothy Pratt did not often allow herself to be in public, and she said, "He is a good-looking boy," which was high praise from Dorothy, and Birdie said, "He is," without false modesty, because he was, and then Dorothy came in and sat at the table and they talked. And the conversation was easier than any they had ever had because babies are good at dissolving the last of the frost between people. Life at the Norris Walden concern went on with all the full and complicated texture of life on a working farm, the seasons cycling with their demands, the land teaching them new things every year, the two of them negotiating and collaborating and sometimes disagreeing, and always coming back to the same fundamental ground, which was that they had chosen each other with clear eyes and meant it. The sorghum operation expanded in the second year. Birdie had read about sorghum syrup production and had ordered a small press from a manufacturer in Missouri and spent 3 weeks figuring out how to use it correctly, which involved a quantity of failed batches that she was crisp and methodical about, and that Lewis ate anyway without complaint, because he was constitutionally against waste, and also because she made coffee to go with the imperfect syrup, and the coffee was always very good. By the 3rd season, the sorghum syrup was a product she was selling at the Caldwell General Store, and by the 4th season, she had a reputation for it across 2 counties, and by the 5th season, she had an arrangement with a merchant in Wichita that made the operation genuinely profitable beyond the wheat and the livestock and the kitchen garden, which itself had expanded from the raised beds to a full quarter-acre growing operation that supplied vegetables to several of the families in Caldwell who did not have kitchen gardens. The land that had been called the Sorrow Acres was not called that anymore. People in Caldwell did not give it a new name because people in small towns resist being seen to revise their own history, but they stopped using the old one, which amounted to the same thing. Lewis had a good nature about the farm's growth in the sense that he was entirely supportive and genuinely interested, but he also had the very particular male pride of a man of that era who was watching his wife run an operation with a kind of focused competence that exceeded most people's understanding of what was possible, and he had to navigate that pride in himself with the self-awareness that came from being an honest person. He had spoken to her about it one evening, very directly in the 4th year, when the sorghum syrup arrangement with the Wichita merchant had been formalized. "I want you to know," he had said, in the measured way he said important things, "that I am aware that the part of this operation you built is the part that is growing fastest, and that I find that more satisfying than I expected to and less complicated than it might have been, and I am paying attention to why that is." Birdie had looked at him over the table where she was doing accounts, Why is it? Because I was here, he said simply. I watched you plan it. I know what it cost you. I am not a man who can be small about something he witnessed happen from the ground up. She had set down her pen and looked at him, and the look had been the kind she reserved for moments when something was so true and so unexpected that she needed a second to absorb it. You are the best person I know, she said. He had looked away, because even after 4 years of her knowing him, she could still catch him off guard with direct statements, and that remained one of her favorite things about him. The Wichita merchant's name was Henry Ugliest, and he was a fair-dealing man who ran a dry goods operation that supplied a network of general stores across the southern Kansas territory. He came to the Lewis Walden concern in person in the spring of the 5th year, 1883, to see the operation because he had, he said, been receiving more inquiries about the syrup than his current contract with Birdie covered, and he wanted to understand what an expanded production might look like. He was a small, well-dressed man in his 40s with a very organized mind, and he and Birdie spent an entire morning going through the production numbers with the focused attention of two people who both understood what they were looking at. Lewis was there for part of it and then went to tend to livestock, not because he was uninterested, but because he was perceptive enough to know that this particular negotiation was something Birdie did better alone, and he trusted her with it completely. The arrangement they reached that afternoon was more than double the existing volume, with a pricing structure Birdie had thought through carefully and written down the night before. And Henry Ugliest had pushed back on 2 points, and she had held on both of them because she knew her production costs better than he did, and she knew the demand better than he thought she did. They shook hands at the end with the mutual satisfaction of people who have dealt with a fair opponent fairly. Calhoun was 4 years old and had begun following Lewis around the property with the absolute conviction of a boy who has decided that his father is the most important person in any landscape. Lewis bore this with a gravity that was also tenderness, explaining to the boy the names and purposes of things with a patience that Birdie watched from a distance sometimes and felt something warm and deep move through her, something that was gratitude and love and the ongoing quiet astonishment of having, finally, everything she needed. A second child came in the autumn of 1884, a girl. They named her Wren, for no particular reason except that Lewis had said the name one evening with a particular quality of sound and Birdie had said, "Yes, that one," and they had both felt the rightness of it. Wren was a quieter child than Calhoun in her first years, which surprised nobody, and she had Birdie's brown eyes and Lewis's capacity for stillness. And she had a habit from very young of examining things very closely before engaging with them, which Lewis said was the most Birdie-like thing he had ever seen in a child, and which Birdie took as the high compliment it was. Caldwell had changed around them over those years. The cattle drives that had defined the town's character through the 1870s were slowing as the railroad pushed westward, and the ranching operations moved accordingly. And the town was negotiating with its own future, some of the old establishments closing, new ones arriving, families settling and building in the way that places build when the wildness is beginning to drain away, and something else is settling in behind it. It was not always a comfortable transition. The men who had built their identities on the particular rawness of the frontier did not always adapt gracefully to the arrival of regularity and permanence. But the Lewis Walden concern was permanent and had been for years now, and it was one of the solid things against which the changes of the decade measured themselves. People referenced it. Farmers with difficult soil came out to look at the raised beds and the thistle-ash method and the south-facing slope planting strategy, and Birdie explained her methods to anyone who asked because she had not learned in isolation. She had learned from Lewis and from books and from the land itself, and from Rupert Shade and from Constance Foley, and from 100 encounters and conversations. And what you receive from community, you have a debt to return to it. There was a man named Aldous Greer who came in the spring of 1885, and who was less interested in the farming than in the land itself. He was a representative of a land consolidation company out of Kansas City, and he sat in their kitchen and drank the coffee Birdie provided and explained, in the smooth and practiced language of men who do this for a living, that his company was interested in acquiring the northwest section of the Lewis Walden property, specifically the original Sorrow Acres deed, for a fair price, because the company had plans for developing a larger consolidated agricultural operation in the county. Birdie listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, which was a skill she had developed and which often made people underestimate how completely she was absorbing what was being said. When he finished, she said, "No." Aldous Greer blinked. Mrs. Walden, the price I am offering is Birdie Norris," she said. "That is my legal name on the deed, and the price is not the issue." Lewis sat at the other end of the table and said nothing because he did not need to. "The issue," Birdie continued, "is that I have spent 7 years building what this land is now from what it was, and the reason it is worth what you are offering is precisely because of that work. And I am not in the habit of selling the result of 7 years of work to a Kansas City company that will then profit from what I built." She folded her hands on the table. "I think you understand that." Aldous Greer understood that. He was a sensible man under the pitch, and he looked at her for a moment and then looked around the kitchen and then said, with something close to respect, "I suppose I do." He left without the land and drove back toward Caldwell, and Lewis said, after the dust of the wagon had settled, "Well." "Well," Birdie agreed. "You know he will be back," Lewis said. "I know," she said, "and the answer will be the same." He picked up his coffee cup and looked at her over the rim. "I love you," he said, which he said when it was true and exactly when he felt it and not according to any other schedule, and that was when it was true, so she said it back in the same way. Greer did come back the following year with a better price and a different argument, and Birdie said no again, and that was the end of it. The land stayed. Rupert Shade retired from the feed store in 1886, and his son, a young man named Marcus who had grown up watching his father deal honestly with everyone in the county, took over the operation and continued the relationship with the Lewis Walden concern without interruption. Vera Shade moved into a smaller house in town and became one of the women Birdie had coffee with when she came to Caldwell, which was regular and practical, and was one of the pleasures of the established life, the regularity of good people. Constance Foley had expanded her dressmaking into a proper shop by 1885, and she employed 2 women who had come to the territory as wives and found themselves needing occupation and income. The piecework she had given Birdie in that first winter had become, over the years, a friendship of the type that is quiet and lasting, and does not require frequent maintenance, but is always exactly there when you return to it. Dorothy Pratt had, over the years, become something that Birdie would not have predicted in that first November in the general store, a reliable person, not exactly warm in her manner, but consistent in her respect and her willingness to say when she had been wrong. She had told Birdie directly in the summer of 1882 that she had said something unkind in 1878, and that she was aware of it. Birdie had said, "You also came and looked at the raised beds and brought blackberry preserves." And Dorothy had said, "That does not undo the first thing," and Birdie had said, "No, but it adds to the record." And they had understood each other completely from that moment, which is about as close to friendship as 2 very different women who were both too honest for their own comfort could reasonably get. By 1887, the Lewis Walden concern was producing wheat, sorghum syrup, milk, eggs, vegetables, and a small secondary operation in seed saving that Birdie had developed, because she had realized that the particular hardy varieties she had adapted for her limestone overclay soil were worth more to other farmers in similar conditions than the standard seed stock available at the feed store, and she had been right about that too. Calhoun was 8 and had strong opinions about horses, and was learning to read with the particular focused determination of a child who has decided reading is important and is not interested in the intermediate steps being slow. Wren was 3 and had a vocabulary that was, as Lewis observed one evening with a quiet pride he did not try to hide, ahead of schedule. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the sound of the fire and the Kansas night outside, Birdie and Lewis sat together in the way they had since February of that first year. And the sitting together had the same quality as then but more depth to it. The depth that comes from years of accumulation, from all the days that had built on each other until what was between them was not new and bright but old and true, which is the better thing. He read sometimes. She did accounts or wrote in the notebooks she had kept since the beginning, which were not diaries exactly but records, observations about the land and the seasons and the work, and occasionally about people and what she had learned from them. She had 12 notebooks filled by 1887, and she kept them in the storage room on a shelf Lewis had built specifically for them without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did, quiet and practical and knowing. She had gone out one October morning in 1887, 9 years after that first October morning, and stood in the same place she had stood when she first arrived, in the middle of the property with the wind coming through, and she had looked at it. The south-facing slope was golden with the late wheat. The raised beds along the eastern flat were in their autumn rest, the soil dark and well-turned, ready for winter cover. The house was larger now, the addition built, the garden mature, a proper barn replacing the collapsed fence of the beginning. The creek ran along the eastern boundary clean and cold, the way Lewis had told her it would in spring, but had become, in fact, a year-round clarity that she had helped along with careful management of the drainage. The thistle was gone. Not a single stand of it remained on the entire property. She stood there for a while with the wind in her face and thought about the county clerk's laugh and the deed, and the people who had called it the Sorrow Acres. And she thought about what it is that makes a thing have value, whether value exists in the thing or whether it is made by the person who cares for it. And she thought the answer was probably both, that the land had always had the capacity for what it had become, and that capacity had been waiting for someone willing to see it and work with it. And that the same might be true of most things, including people. Lewis found her there. He came out across the property from the barn, and he came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and they stood together in the October wind. 9 years, she said. 9 years, he agreed. Do you remember telling me about the winter wheat, she said, at the fence line, the first week? I remember you were writing in a notebook, he said, and I had already decided you were going to be fine before I knew your name. She looked at him. He was 40 now, and the years had settled into him the way years settle into good landscape. Not as damage, but as character, the line of his jaw a little more defined, the gray more present at his temples. His eyes were still that sage-after-rain color. You never told me that, she said. I thought it was presumptuous, he said. You had enough to deal with without someone telling you they had decided you were going to be fine. She took his hand the way she had learned to do, without asking, because after 9 years the asking was already done. I was glad you came that day. I was glad you did not send me away, he said. She laughed, because it was almost what he had said on the step in February of the first winter, and they both heard the echo of it and the continuity in it. What do you want from the next 9 years? She asked because she was always planning forward and she liked to plan with him. He looked at the land for a while. More of this, he said. He was quiet for a moment. And I would like another child, he said carefully, the way he said things that mattered to him, the ones he was not sure how the other person would receive. If that is something you would, yes, she said, the same word the same way. Always the same way when she meant it. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the barn when she had told him about Calhoun, the one where everything opened at once. They walked back to the house together as the October light went golden, and the wheat on the south-facing slope caught it and held it, and the creek made its steady sound along the eastern boundary, and somewhere in the house, a child's voice called out something, and Lewis answered it through the window before they were even inside, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, and everything about it was as natural and full and real as anything Birdie had ever known. The third child came in the summer of 1888, another boy, and they named him August because he was born in August, and because it was a name that sounded like the season, warm and full and entirely itself. August Walden was a boy who slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with a placid interest that was entirely foreign to both of his parents, but that they found absolutely charming, as if the universe had decided to give them, this time, a child who balanced the fierce intensity of his mother and his older brother and his 3-year-old sister, who was now 5 and had opinions about everything. Calhoun was 9 by then, and already helping with real work on the farm, which he approached with Lewis's seriousness and Birdie's organizational intelligence. Lewis had given him a horse of his own in the spring, a calm dun gelding named Pepper, and Calhoun had taken the responsibility with a gravity that had moved both his parents, the gravity of a boy who understands that some things are not games. Wren had learned to read the same summer with the same focused determination as her brother before her, and she had an attachment to Birdie's notebooks that Birdie watched with a particular pleasure. One afternoon she had found Wren sitting in the storage room looking very seriously at one of the earliest notebooks, the one from the 1st October, the one where Birdie had recorded the terrible state of the land in careful, neat handwriting, and Wren had looked up and said, "Is this when you first came here?" And Birdie had said yes, and Wren had said, "It was very bad then," looking at the notes with her father's careful reading expression. "Yes," Birdie had said, "it was." And Wren had looked back at the notebook and said, "But you wrote it down," as if that explained everything, and Birdie had thought, yes, exactly that. The fall of 1888 brought a hard, early frost that took out a portion of the sorghum crop before it was fully in, which was a loss and a setback, and they dealt with it the way they dealt with all setbacks practically, and without excessive mourning, adjusting the accounts, planning the following year differently, making decisions about what the land needed next. This was the texture of the life, and Birdie had known from the beginning that the texture of the life would be this: the good seasons and the bad ones, the years of abundance and the years of correction, the constant negotiation with weather and soil and market, and all the things that were beyond controlling but not beyond responding to. Lewis had a skill for the bad seasons that she found invaluable and had come to depend on. He did not catastrophize and he did not minimize. He assessed and he planned, and he was steady in a way that was different from her steadiness. Hers was the steadiness of will, of determination, of the person who has decided that a thing will happen and is organizing reality to accommodate it. His was the steadiness of patience, of the person who has watched many seasons and knows that the land will come back around if you tend it honestly. Together, they covered more ground than either alone. By 1890, Caldwell had changed significantly. The cattle drives were largely history, the railroad had reshaped the commerce of the territory, and the town was settling into a different kind of identity, more domestic and agricultural and mercantile and less raw. The particular brand of frontier wildness that had characterized the late 1870s was not entirely gone, but it was diminished, held now more in memory, and in the stories people told than in the daily reality of the place. But the land was always the land. The Norris Walden concern sat on its northwestern edge of the county, with its winter wheat and its sorghum syrup, and its kitchen garden and its seed-saving operation, and its 3 children and its pair of adults, who had understood each other from a fence line in October of 1878, and had built everything from that understanding. And the land that had been worthless was worth something now, was worth a great deal. And the people in Caldwell who had lived there long enough had watched the whole arc of it and had the decency, most of them, to feel something when they thought about it. Rupert Shade said it best, on an October afternoon in 1890, sitting in the Norris Walden kitchen, retired now, but still visiting with the comfortable ease of someone who is always welcome, looking at the harvest numbers Birdie had spread on the table, looking at the kitchen garden visible through the window going to its winter rest, looking at Lewis coming in from the barn with mud on his boots and Calhoun right behind him, looking at Wren doing something methodical at the counter and August toddling around the kitchen with the cheerful aimlessness of a 2-year-old. "You know what you built out there," Rupert Shade said to Birdie. "A working concern," she said, echoing what he had said 7 years ago with a small smile. "I was wrong," he said. "That is not what you built. A working concern is just a farm." He gestured at the window, at the slope of the wheat, at the whole of it. "You built a place. You built a place where there was nothing but sorry soil and thistle, and you built a place." Birdie looked at him for a moment and then looked out the window at the south-facing slope, golden in the October light, exactly as it had been 12 years ago, except that now it was full and real and hers, deeply and completely hers. "Yes," she said simply. "I did." Lewis came through the door with mud on his boots and caught the tail end of whatever was being said, the way he caught the tail ends of things and understood them without the preamble. He looked at Birdie and she looked at him, and the look between them had the quality it had always had, direct and knowing and full. And he set his hat on the hook and washed his hands and sat down at the table and said, "Is there coffee?" in the tone of a man who has been outside since dawn and knows there is coffee but wants to be told there is coffee. And she poured it, and Rupert Shade laughed, and Wren said something observational from the counter. And August sat down abruptly in the middle of the floor and looked at his own hands with the absorbed expression he always had when he had just discovered something. And Calhoun came in behind his father and went straight to the bread on the sideboard, and the kitchen was full of noise and warmth, and the smell of coffee and the autumn light came through the window and lay across the table in a long warm bar, and everything in the room was as real and true and accounted for as the soil records in the storage room, everything named and tended and known. This was what she had built. This was what she had built on the ugliest plot of land in the territory before that first spring was over, and it had only grown larger and truer in the years since, and it had grown from the exact same thing that everything on this land had grown from. The knowledge that worthless is never a permanent condition, that what looks like sorrow is often only potential waiting for someone willing to look at it long enough to see what it actually is. Birdie Norris Walden poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table among all the people she had made her life with, and looked out the window at the land, and thought, as she had thought many times in different ways, that the county clerk could have laughed all he wanted. She had always intended to be exactly here. Lewis's knee found hers under the table, the way it always did when he sat beside her, the small casual contact of two people who have chosen to be next to each other for so long that it has become as natural as breathing, and she pressed back, and that was everything, and everything was enough.